are heading to Outlaws at Thunder Junction, and with that, we're going to be committing some crimes. So, for those who don't know, Outlaws at Thunder Junction is introducing the new commit a crime mechanic. So, as it says here, you commit a crime whenever you cast a spell, activate an ability, or put a triggered ability on the stack that targets one or more of the following: an opponent, a spell or ability that opponent controls, a permanent that opponent controls, or a card in that opponent's graveyard. That made me thinking to myself, I wondered, well, that's quite an interesting ability, how they're going to play into it. And we've seen halfway through Thunder Junction spoilers that there are a bunch of cards which have the text, whenever you commit a crime, X happens. One example we see here from further down is Glitter the Hellraiser. Whenever we commit a crime, we make 2/2/2 zombies. It only triggers once a turn, but seems pretty good. So, with that in mind and the knowledge that there could be some more coming, I've seen one multicolored one which I believe makes mercenaries once a turn. I thought to myself, I wonder how criminal my commander decks are. So, I decided to go and look through them here. So, first things first, I will specify here. I included everything that could potentially commit a crime. So, I first include triggers like Outlaw's Merriment, where the only option for a crime is the random occurrence that we get the rogue and ping someone. I also included conditional crimes, for example Azorius Charm, where we can only target an attacking or blocking creature. The card still has the potential to commit a crime, so I've left it in the list. And finally, I included things which technically could commit a crime even though they're not advantageous or unoptimal. For example, this Guild Mage here can put a 1/1 counter on a creature. It doesn't specify it has to be our creature, so we could trigger it that way. With that in mind, here are my 10 decks. So I've basically purged a lot of my commander decks to just get down to 10 hyper-focused ones I can build around, because there's too much release content right now. I literally can't go through everything, but that's a different discussion. So, we have a aristocrat deck which is built around basically achieving a line of getting out a persist creature with the Simic creature's ability to put 1/1 counters on it and trigger an infinite sack loop. We have a chaos deck which is built around achieving nothing, because everything in there is random. It flips a coin, rolls a dice, targets randomly, cascades, things like that. We have choices, which is all the split cards from Magic, so split cards, aftermath, fuse cards, things like that. We have our all creature deck, which is an Omri companion deck where literally it's lands and creatures and nothing else. We have a Magecraft deck. This deck is built around deploying creatures which care about us casting on creature spells like Young Pyromancers and other Magecraft triggers like Sagemoor Witch and stuff like that, to flood the board with tokens, gain advantage, and swing out. We have Multicolor Payoff, which is our sister's deck. This is a deck that cares about the Eidolon cycle that had the text, whenever you cast a creature, bounce back, It's about creatures leaving our graveyard. Zerda, this is our Guild Mages deck, so it's all the Guild Mages in history. And then we have a 1v1 deck, which is built for the 1v1 matches online, where basically we're hyper-focused on targeting and hitting our opponent and essentially assembling a combo. And finally we have an experience deck, which is built around all the commanders which care about gaining us the experience counters. So, with that in mind, I went through each of these decks and thought to myself, well, let's see how bad they are at committing crimes. So I'm going to have a little talk about this, and this is quite surprising to me. So, tied for last place was my Aristocrat deck and my Creatures Only deck. So if we go in here, this list, as I've said before, is really focused on just achieving a combo. And looking into it, there wasn't a lot of things in here that committed a crime. Most predominantly, the funniest thing was, our damage outlets like Mayhem Devil and Judith were actually some of the only things here that committed a crime. We also had a little bit of removal and things like that, but nothing too crazy. The same with creatures. Ironically, Judith and Mayhem Devil are also in my creature deck. That's where they also triggered here. However, funnily enough, there was a strange thing I noticed going through the deck, was that a couple of my random initiative creatures had a weird way of committing crimes. Like, for example, Stirring Bard could give creatures haste, which is technically committing a crime, and Blood Boil Sorcerer could technically trigger goad on a target creature, another way of committing a crime. So yeah, 5 crimes. They could potentially commit 5 crimes, so they're pretty safe. Next was our Experience deck, which was crazy enough. This deck is hyper-focused on finding and casting these creatures to gain value, you know, the ones that care about us gaining experience counters. So aside from that, there wasn't a lot. A lot of it was actually conditional, so we had like Is It Charm, where we could do 2 damage or not. And then we had Drown in the Loch, which technically countering a spell isn't a crime, but killing a creature is a crime. I feel like that's a little backward. We also had random things like Reflector Mage, which targets creatures, and so forth and so on. With that in mind, though, we do make a little jump here, and it gets quite interesting. The next deck we had with potentially 14 crimes was the Multicolor Payoff deck. As I've said before, this deck is built around these Eidolons here with the line, whenever you cast a multicolor spell, return it from graveyard to your hand. So we want to discard these creatures to the graveyard, cast a multicolor spell, bring them back, and trigger effects like Desecrated Tomb on newly acquired Insidious Roots, and Soul Evisceration. Now this deck potentially commits 14 crimes. A ton of it is just multicolored interaction. Again, this is a deck deciding to build a bunch of tokens through Quintorius effects and all this stuff. So a lot of our thing was targeted removal. We had things like Vindicate, we had I believe, where is the other one? Ironically, we also had Vanish into Memory, which we would ideally want to exile our own creature, but we can target an opponent, so it got included in. We have Drown with Filth, which gives a target creature negative. There was a lot of interaction here. And this is probably sitting in line with what everyone else was effectively expecting here. Then we had Magecraft, which also came up at 15, which is crazy. And I was highly expecting this one to be higher. This deck is built around, like I said, Young Pyro effects. So it's loaded with tons of ways for us to just randomly pick off little creatures, bounce things, do damage that way. It was, random. We're running Terminate here. We have Reckless Charm, which can target an artifact, so that's another crime potentially there. Not much to say. I really thought this would be one of the highest. Then, funnily enough, beating them both out was Chaos, with potentially 16 crimes. So at this point, I think anything above this is where we are going to have what I potentially believe decks that are worthy of running these crime cards. We're going to have to look at them and review them. The craziest thing about this deck is so many of the things were just insane. So like our random cards that we play to just cascade, target a creature, deny reality, bounces a creature. A lot of stuff, yeah. It was absolutely crazy how many of these cards did. Comet randomly has a mode that will do damage, so he targets. Kaya targets cards in the graveyard. Our random sagas like King Nafi's Betrayal exiles cards from the graveyard. The Trickster God's Heist targets 2 permanents, so commits crimes. I was not expecting the Chaos deck to be this high on the legal thing. So, with that in mind, we are now into, I believe, our top 3 cards. So, we have left Choices, Mages, and 1v1. Now, based on my description, you'd think it would be a certain way, but I assure you it's not. Crazily enough, 1v1 came in 3rd as a crime deck, which is insane to me because this deck is literally, as you can just see from this second line here, this deck is just built to target and kill your opponent's stuff and gain us advantage. I mean, this came up at 20 cards total for interaction. So it's our 3rd most criminal deck according to the new crime mechanic. Then we go to the craziest one to me, which I never expected this card to be this high. Our Guild Mages deck is 24 potential crimes. Because, ironically looking at it, so many of these Guild Mages actually target things like little creatures. For example here, detain an online permanent, tap a creature. So tap a creature. Give something intimidate. Ping something. There was so many that was crazy. So 24 potential crimes out of this deck. And to no surprise, well, you only know what's coming next. But running away with it as the most criminal deck I play is our Choices deck, with 34 potential crimes in this deck. 34 potential crimes. Nearly, 35% of this deck commits a crime, which is pure, unadulterated insanity to me. And how is that possible? Well, when each card is 2 spells and each card is unoptimal interaction, yeah, it's going to happen. Destroy an artifact, that's a crime. Destroy an enchantment, that's a crime. Deal damage to a flying creature, that's a crime. Exile a creature, that's a crime. Ping an opponent, that's a crime. This was absolutely insane to me. But I looked at the numbers here, and I decided that, yeah, it is honestly worth looking at these crime cards. And I would recommend everyone else to just go through your decks and see how criminal you are, and whether or not these triggers might be worth it. I definitely will be reviewing with a full set of Thunder Junction to see if we can actually run any of these crimes. Yeah, so we'll just say this. After a thorough investigation, I can confirm that every one of my decks commits a crime, and the most criminal of my decks is apparently my split card tribal. Let me know how criminal your decks are.